to kick us off with just a little bit of a story to let you know of my own experience. This is a picture of me taken in the summer of 2008. That summer, I was an intern in Fort Myers, Florida, and I spilled coffee down the front of that white blouse 20 seconds after this picture was taken. Fort Myers, I don't know if we have any Florida folks in the audience, but Fort Myers was a great city for the beach at age 23. Not probably a wonderful city in terms of catering to the nightlife of young people, which was great given that I was there for an internship. But that summer, I had a really interesting experience. I was co-supervised by two people, Chris and Heidi, and these two supervisors I had gave me vastly different approaches and perspectives about how I should move through this internship as a young adult. One of them was really focused on making sure that I had the tools and resources I needed to speak up and to ask questions. And the other gave me a lot of advice, both explicitly and implicitly, around this idea of, hey, you're the youngest and the least informed here, so really keep your mouth shut while you're here. And those two perspectives were really difficult for me because they felt really conflicting. I ended up operating between two extremes really all summer long. I was operating out of this false confidence that I hadn't really earned yet as a young person who was just trying to figure out where the restrooms were and how to print things. And then on the very other side of the spectrum, I also had this insecurity I tried to mask of feeling like I was the youngest and the least experienced, and I knew it. And really trying to figure out, how do I make a unique impact? How do I build the kind of life in which my values and how I show up at work match the way that I want to live my day-to-day life at home? And I see this same exact question with a lot of the students that I work with, and I'm sure many of you see this at your campuses too. It's this idea of, how do I show up and balance these two skills in a way that can create positive social change for me, for the causes and communities that I care about, and more importantly, for the people that I'm surrounded by, whether formally or informally, through my leadership roles. And so it's something that I have created some curriculum around, and I'm interested to get your take on it today, because I know all of us in this room are experts in something. And I think it's powerful to see how we can connect some of the same ideas to different contexts. So my whole idea, my whole goal by the time we're done with this, is that you leave with at least one new tool or one new strategy for yourself as a professional, or for the students that you work with moving into the fall semester. Really, all we're talking about is this balance between confidence on one side and humility on the other. Two terms we often hear about in day-to-day life, but we don't often talk about in collaboration with each other. Most of us recognize that having a balance between confidence and humility might be something important as a leadership skill. But I've found, especially in my work on my campus, we really struggle with giving students a chance to thread that needle, because it's so nuanced and it's so steeped in a lot of narratives and messaging that we get at home and in our K-12 education that are really easy for us to overlook. So before we dive into what this is or how to start doing it, I just want to start with 3 challenges that make confident humility a really hard skill for us to teach students, particularly in a leadership space. The first of those challenges is that we get really conflicting messages about what confident humility means. And according to a recent study that was posted through the Harvard Business Review earlier this year, confident humility is one of the most difficult skills to gain in early adulthood, strictly because of the conflicting messages that we get about it. And I'm putting a few of those up on screen for you to take a quick look through. You'll see here a few different kinds of messages that we typically see. And I'm curious if any of you have seen these or experienced these in your own life. So take a look through those. Fake it till you make it, but be transparent. Respect your elders, but advocate for yourself. Ask questions, but don't be a bother. If those are things you have experienced or you have seen, either in yourself or your students, give me a little thumbs up. I'm scrolling through to see some of you who I see are on screen. Okay, wonderful. Yeah, absolutely. And so with that in mind, we know that this is particularly true when we are recognizing power dynamics and when we're thinking about power and positional authority. I know a lot of us talk about leadership in a much broader term than that and focus on leadership in a broader term than that. But this can be a lot of the narrative that we fight against when students come to our campuses and recognize that confident humility is a conflicting set of messages. All right, next. The second challenge that makes this really difficult is historical power. So we know historically our social systems have dictated who gets to be confident and who has to be humble. And we know that societal power and privilege are a really, really big part of this. So we know Race, gender, class, and citizenship specifically all have really strong impacts on the way we're perceived as confident or as humble. We know that a lot of times people of color in our communities are often marginalized and dismissed for the exact same confident display of characteristics and attributes that are celebrated in people who are white. We know traditionally men who act confident, cisgender men who act confident, are told that they are impressive or that they're professional, while a lot of women and non-binary folks who display that same attribute can be seen as bossy or as uptight. So it's important, I think, that we ground this conversation in this idea that we have not all had the same access to nor the same benefit of positive intent when it comes to who gets to have confidence and who has to have humble humility and humble behavior to be taken quote unquote seriously. Alicia Garza, one of the leaders of the Black Lives Matter movement, talked about this and said it's really a question of how we see leadership and who we think deserves it. So that's something else to keep in mind. The third challenge with this whole conversation is that training in confident humility is really hard to find. We know that there isn't much content or training for people with this skill. It's a lot like 6-year-olds on a soccer field. We can't get better at something that we don't practice. And so if we're not giving our students a chance to develop this skill and figure out the nuance between confidence and humility, we can't expect them to be able to navigate that and execute that skill with a lot of strength when the stakes feel higher once they're out of our campus institutions. So now that we've talked a little bit about some of the challenges, I want to just share the basic definition of what we're going to be covering here for the next little bit. So confident humility, this is a definition of the term through Adam Grant and through his book, Think Again, which is one of my favorites to read. He talks about how confident humility is being secure enough in ourselves and our strengths to be able to admit our ignorance and our weaknesses. And he basically talks about it like this through this grid. He says the sweet spot is when we have confidence in ourselves and we have a healthy disregard for our tools and our strategies. So a lot like our definition of the healthy disregard for the impossible with LeaderShape, we need to have a disregard with our own ability to come up with the right solution or even be addressing the right questions. In his book, and Think Again, Adam Grant talks about how if we have total assuredness in ourselves, but we also have that level of confidence in our strategies, that can lead us to blind arrogance and not recognizing the perspectives or approaches of others that we're working with. But on the flip side, if we don't have any confidence in ourselves and we don't have any confidence in our tools or our strategies, then we have this debilitating sense of doubt where we don't ever make or affect positive change in community with other people because we're so unsure of opening our mouth to say anything. So he says in the book that the primary goal is that we have this balance where we're confident in ourselves and where we're questioning the strategies that we have at the table. Another great way to talk about this is through another author I really like, James Clear, in his book, Atomic Habits, is an excellent audiobook if anybody needs any recommendation for their work commute these days. James Clear says this, he says, one version of confidence is I've got this figured out. Another version is I can figure this out. He says the first is arrogant and closed-minded. The second is humble and open-minded. Be humble about what you know, but confident about what you can learn. So with all of that in mind, this is the definition that I'm going to use for the rest of our time together today. It's using Adam Grant's definition of security in ourself and admitting our ignorance and weaknesses. But I would also add this last portion in orange about how it's really maintaining an unshakable sense of quiet self-worth while eager to learn from the expertise, ideas, and perspectives of other people. A great example of this definition was actually seen at the very beginning of the pandemic. In March of 2020, the NBA was the first major sports league to shut down. And this is a picture of NBA Commissioner Adam Silver. And Adam stood up in front of his team at the beginning of March and displayed some pretty significant confident humility when he told them this. He said, I don't know how we're going to get games running again, but I believe in our ability to figure it out. And as a result of that approach, Adam gave his team and the people that he was leading a chance to be able to stay confident in their ability while questioning their strategies. And through that ability, they were able to innovate and collaborate in new ways. And that summer, they were the first league to reopen without a single COVID-19 infection. So a really great example of this confident humility behavior. The analogy I often use is that of a camping tent or a camping tent pole. You need to ground into the ground and have such security in who you are that you're then able to connect out and share what you have with the world in collaboration with the skills and talents of other people. I will tell you all, I went to the Boundary Waters a few years ago. And for those of you who like that kind of outdoorsy behavior, congratulations to you. It was not my jam. But this was a really good analogy for me because I was my role for our campsite was putting the tent together. And every time I would stick that stake in the ground, it had to go down far enough into the earth to be able to be confident and supported before we connected it to the other poles. Otherwise, we were in for trouble in the middle of the night if a tent fell down and collapsed. So that's always the analogy I think of. How do I ground in with confidence so that I'm able to connect out with other people through humility? So before we move on, I'm curious to have you consider who in your life role models this best. So take a moment, either think through that on your own. I'm going to put just about 45 seconds here on the clock. And if you are so inclined and would be willing to share with the community, you're welcome to include that in the chat. Give us the first name and one sentence to describe who in your life role models this best and what makes you think of them. Okay, wonderful. Nicole, thanks for sharing. Nicole says, an old mentor of mine. Danae says, Kathy, my mother, who leads with compassion but questions the process. Oh, I love that language. That's wonderful. Feel free to continue typing if you'd like to share with the group. And if you don't want to share with the group, totally fine. One thing I would ask you to do if you're willing is, whether now or once we wrap up today, one thing I would love to have you do is to send a quick text or an email to the person that you are thinking of to let them know that they are the person who comes to mind in your life. I'm amazed at the number of times where we speak so highly of the work and skill of the people we admire, but we don't give ourselves permission to share that with them out loud if they're not in the room. So think about doing that if that's something that you might be willing to. That's an idea for later on. Great. Awesome. I'm seeing some great stuff here in the chat. Thanks, Alyssa, Jasmine, Liza. Wonderful. Okay. So this idea, confident humility, we've talked about what challenges it poses in terms of giving and creating a skill that we can both emulate in ourselves and teach other people. But oftentimes my students look at me like this and say, okay, but why should I care about this? I have a chemistry exam that I need to study for. I have 2 student organizations I'm part of that need my attention. Why is this skill something that should take up my mental space and emotional bandwidth on a Tuesday morning or a Thursday afternoon? And one thing I want to be sure and share with you is a reminder that we have a lot of data to suggest that this skill is not only important for us and for our students in a leadership space, but when it comes to the social capital of procuring a job and getting our students to their next step after their undergraduate journey, it's directly tied into the competencies that we know that they need. So for any of you who are unfamiliar, the National Association of Colleges and Employers is a professional organization that connects over 16,000 college recruiters, employers, and career services professionals across the country. And through their data and their wonderful research, we know about these particular career competencies that indicate what skills our students need to be hireable. One of those competencies is career and self-development. And they define that as basically developing oneself and career through continual learning, awareness of strengths and weaknesses, and navigating career opportunities, networking, building relationships, some of the emotionally intelligent skills that we know students need to be able to connect with people in their industry who can connect them with the right kinds of employment to feel both fulfilled and sustained in what they got their degree in. Career and self-development as a particular competency is defined by these sample behaviors. These are 9 sample behaviors that NACE as an organization says show us whether or not a student has career and self-development. Of those 9 different sample behaviors, 6 of them are directly related to confident humility. You'll notice it talks about identifying areas for growth. It talks about establishing and leveraging relationships with other people who can help you professionally, being a participant and seeking to understand and embrace development opportunities. So a lot of different kinds of behaviors that indicate whether a student, or whether any of us rather as professionals, have this career and self-development skill. Another reason that this matters is because it's well documented in terms of evidence-based benefits. So according to the University of Pennsylvania, we know that our confident humility increases. Once that happens, so does our accuracy at work, our critical thinking skills, the respect that we have with our colleagues and with our peers, our earning potential as professionals, and it decreases our level of anxiety. I thought that one was particularly interesting. And I'm not sure about any of you, but I know in myself, these are 4 things I would love more of and 1 thing I would definitely want less of. So those are some good things to be aware of in terms of why this is important. Now that we know what it is and why it's important, I want to take a quick glance before we dive into some strategies about what confident humility is not. So there are 5 myths of confident humility that have emerged from the data that I've been reading through on this topic over the summer. We don't have time today for me to debunk all 5 of them in real time with you, but if you'd like some additional resources that give us some extra grounding or extra teeth around this, let me know at the end and I'm happy to share this with you. The first myth about confident humility, particularly from the perspective of our students, is that I won't be seen as credible unless I act sure of myself. Myth number 2, my confidence must come from my performance and productivity. Myth number 3, humility will be viewed as weak, passive, or insecure. Myth 4, any attempt to celebrate my accomplishments will be seen as boastful or bragging. And myth number 5, confident humility is an oxymoron. It's impossible to be both. I want you to take a quick look at those 5 myths. I've listed them all on screen for you here. And Juan, if you'd be willing to help me out and launch our poll, what I would love to see is, if you're willing to, I want you to indicate which of these 5 myths do you see your students fall into most? We have a lot of data to suggest that these 5 myths are not true, but we know that they're really pervasive in our day-to-day lives. So as we launch this poll, let me see here if we can get this pulled up. Perfect.
I'm not sure if you're able to do
Is
it
it?
as close. It looks like it's not working for me anymore. Would maybe a chat response work for this if the poll
You
won't work
know,
for you too?
let me take a look here, Juan. I think I just published it. How we doing?
Yeah, the poll just came up.
Yep, it's up.
Okay, great. Perfect. Thanks, everybody. Go ahead and indicate there which of these myths resonate most based on what you see among your students. All right, so it looks like we have a lot of people. Well, we have some representation across all 5, but the front runner is myth number 2. My confidence must come from my performance and productivity. I gave a version of this workshop to a group of full-time staff at an organization last Friday afternoon. And I asked them this question about themselves, and the distribution was almost identical from what we're saying today we see with our students. A lot of people and a lot of us still focus on falling into the myth that confidence must be tied to performance and productivity. So thank you, everybody. I'm giving you a quick glance so you can take a look through and see the distribution of this poll, but a lot of people indicating that they're seeing myth number 2 across their students, some who are also mentioning myth number 1 and number 4 as other front runners. So I won't be seen as credible unless I act sure of myself, and any attempt to celebrate my accomplishments will be seen as boastful or bragging. Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for participating. We'll go ahead and move on. But I want you to think about, one thing you could even do is frame up these 5 myths with your students to give them some perspective and ask their opinions, to say, hey, where do you see this in your day-to-day life at school and at home? Where did you see this in your family of origin or your caregivers growing up? And how does this impact the way you show up as a leader on this campus, in your classes, in your professional and personal life? That could be a really interesting discussion to get us started. Okay, moving on. We've talked a little bit about what confident humility is, why it matters, what it's not. I want to move into a little bit of a visual framework that I've created and that I use with my students called the Confident Humility Wheel. Now, I use this in the leadership coursework I teach here at Drake, but I also use it in my business to work with clients to give them some perspective in helping us identify where we each fall on this continuum. So this is a picture of the Confident Humility Wheel. I'm certainly not an artist and certainly not a pro when it comes to any kind of digital or graphic design. So please give me some grace for any of you who are much better at this skill than I am. But this is a Confident Humility Wheel. The reason it's a wheel is because there's no linear progression and it's difficult to find balance. So at the top is confident humility. That's the goal, is to camp out there as often as possible. But sometimes we fall toward insecurity on one side or arrogance on the other. And you'll notice both of those two extremes are actually much closer on the wheel than we might think. And given this particular visual, the idea behind that is that both arrogance and insecurity can come from the same place of not feeling enough, not feeling good enough, not feeling competent enough, or having been told either explicitly or implicitly that what we have to bring to the table isn't valued or respected. So a lot of us who struggle with imposter syndrome, which primarily could be any of us in this room, certainly has been me before, is really focused on that extreme at the bottom, that sense of feeling like I'm not enough or I'm too much. So we know insecurity is one extreme. Insecure behavior typically downplays our abilities, our skills, and our accomplishments. We often use self-deprecation or humor, casual put downs to be able to manage other people's impressions of us. If we're worried about coming across as cocky or as conceited or as arrogant, we can downplay our positive qualities. An example of somebody who shows us a great perspective when it comes to insecurity is Erin Hannon on The Office. I don't know if we have any old Office fans here, but played by Ellie Kemper. She would be a great example of somebody who shows up at work, day-to-day life, and displays pretty significant insecurity. Now, on the opposite side of things is arrogance, and we'll talk about this more in just a little bit, but this is when a person believes that they're better than everybody else. They have an exaggerated sense of their own self-importance. They have a sense of superiority that paradoxically keeps them stuck. A great example of somebody who displays a lot of arrogant behavior would be Jamie Tart on Ted Lasso, if we have any Ted Lasso fans in the audience. That would be an example of some extreme arrogant behavior. So again, in the middle would be confident humility. These are the people who have a strong sense of their strengths and their areas for improvement. But instead of letting these perceived weaknesses lead to their own insecurity, they actually reach out to other people for support. And we know that because confident people aren't staking their sense of self on outcomes, they're more likely to collaborate, to celebrate the achievements of other people in their organization or community. They can ask for help and take calculated risk, and they pursue opportunities that are risky because they know their innate sense of self won't be threatened if it doesn't go well. Now, what can typically happen and what we can typically see with our students is that we can confuse these terms because they're so similar in the way people talk about them day to day. So when we struggle finding balance on confidence, what can typically happen is that we struggle figuring out the difference between confidence and arrogance, and we fall toward that extreme of the confident humility wheel. So the example that I always use is that the behaviors of a confident person and an arrogant person, when it comes to student leaders, might seem the same on the outside, but they're actually vastly different. So what we typically think of when we think of arrogance is something like this. You can see it says the narcissist test. Step 1, take a moment to think about yourself. Step 2, if you make it to step 2, you are not a narcissist. But we typically think of this kind of extreme behavior, but arrogance is typically more insidious than that. I really like this quote from Brené Brown from her book, Atlas of the Heart. She says, I see now that confidence and arrogance look similar from the outside, but their internal motivations are different. From the outside, I appeared confident that I could get anything done. But on the inside, I was pridefully ignoring the warning signs and pushing forward because of my exaggerated sense of ability. Do you see the difference? Adam Grant puts it this way in his book. He says 2 questions that can help us avoid bleeding into arrogance from confidence are asking, how do I know for sure? And what if I'm wrong? 2 really great questions we can pose to ourselves and to our students too. Now, on the opposite side of the confident humility wheel, some of us might struggle or watch our students struggle about the difference between humility and insecurity and fall toward that extreme. So when we're looking at those 2 things, one of the great ways we can help differentiate this is another quote by Brené Brown, where she says, I'm here to get it right, not to be right. She talks about how humility is actually a set of behaviors. And this is something that's also mentioned by a global journalist named Farah Nasir, who talks about humility as an intellectual exercise, not just an emotional one. Both of these women talk about how humility is taking a risk even when you think you're right. It's opening yourself up to new ways of thinking. It's caring more about the truth rather than your own opinion. And it's acknowledging that you don't know it all and acknowledging that publicly, not just in your own head. So typically when I work with students and we focus on this confident humility wheel, in order to move away from insecurity, we help work with them to add genuine confidence to their own level of self-awareness. If we're working with a student who falls more toward the arrogant side of things, we help them add humility as a leadership practice. And what I typically, when I tell students this, a lot of them look at me and say, okay, great, but where do I fall? I think I'm somebody who falls more on the side of feeling like I'm overly insecure as opposed to confidently humble. Or, you know what, I think I can tend toward arrogance because that's what I saw modeled or that's what I thought was respected. So I'm going to walk you through a quick confident humility quiz that I do with my students. If you're interested in doing this yourself, all you're going to need is a scratch piece of paper and a pen. I'll tell you right away up front that these answers won't be shared with anybody else, so be as honest as you can be. And I want you to make a little T-chart on your piece of paper and write part 1 on the left side and part 2 on the right. And what I want you to do next is to take a look at this. So for the purposes of being on a webinar, I'm not going to read each of these different prompts to you. I'm going to go ahead and put part 1 up on the screen. And for part 1, I'm going to give you 10 prompts. I want you to read through these 10 prompts and make a tally mark on the left side of your T-chart if you've seen yourself exhibit any of these behaviors in the last 6 months. I'll give you about a minute to do so, and then we'll move on. Okay, everybody, take another 15 seconds or so to wrap this part up. Okay, we're going to move on to part 2. So on the other side of your T-chart, I'm going to put up the part 2 prompts. Go ahead and again, read through these 10 statements. And in just a second, I will have you go ahead and indicate where you notice these in yourself as well. All right, we have about 30 seconds left before we're going to move on. Okay, so take a look now. You should have 2 sets of tally marks on your scratch piece of paper. And I want you just silently on your own to go ahead and tabulate those and see where you might fall on your own scale for confident humility. Which of the 2 extremes are you more likely to tend toward? So go ahead and take a look at that. Now, I know some of you who are academics in the audience might say, where did this quiz come from? This is something I have 100% made up as a way to be able to get my students to start talking and thinking about this. So this is not statistically significant. This is not reliable, nor is it valid. But I think it can give us a chance to at least start them with something when it comes to this scale. So take a look. And as you look through this, if you have a higher number, a higher tally mark in part 1, then you likely need to focus on shifting from insecurity to confidence. If you scored higher in part 2, on the other hand, you might want to focus on shifting from arrogance toward humility. And that's typically how I encourage this among my students, is to say, okay, great. You might be looking at me like this thinking, hey, where do I get started? How do I make an effort? And how do I start to thread this needle a little bit more carefully when it comes to the way I approach my leadership style and behavior with other people? One of the things I tell my students often when it comes to this skill set is it's really easy for us to talk about this in theory, but it's a lot harder for us to be able to indicate it in practice. And so for the purposes of our time together in the next 15 minutes, I'm going to walk you through 5 strategies to build confident humility as a way to affect social change among our students. In the leadership program that I direct here at Drake University, one of the things I often say to our prospective students and to families that are looking to apply to this program is that it's really hard to be an effective leader when people are constantly dodging a chance to work with you. That's true for students in a chemistry project, but it's also true for us as professionals. It's hard to make an impact with the causes and communities that we're part of if people don't want to work with us or be around us. And so while emotional intelligence and communication and self-awareness and equity and inclusion, those are all concepts we need to focus on so specifically when it comes to our work as leadership educators. This is a skill set that we get a chance to practice and role model for our students in our own behavior. And so I'm sharing these 5 strategies with you. I would argue that these can go both directions. These are strategies you can use in applying with your students, but these are also strategies that you can just focus on exhibiting as a leadership educator and thinking about how you can role model this behavior when they interact with you. So strategy number 1 is to identify what you have to offer. It's really easy for us to focus on confidence building without giving our students or ourselves the training and techniques we need to actually develop it ourselves. Oftentimes, we still focus on this hamster wheel of performance and productivity to build our sense of self-worth. And if our self-worth is always tied to our to-do list or our list of accomplishments, that means it's pretty fragile. And it's really easy for us to get the wind knocked out of our sails when things don't go right or when we take a risk and it ends poorly. In a former role I used to have prior to my time at Drake, I was at the University of Minnesota, Twin Cities. I know we have some folks from that area here on the call. And one of the things I used to do was prepare students for their interviews to medical school. And I would see hundreds of applicants come in my office and talk about why they should be accepted to that program. And one of the things that they said a lot when I would ask them the question, what is it that you have to offer? I would ask it this way. I would say, what do your skills, your personality, and your experience provide that nobody else can replicate? Most students couldn't answer that question. They would say things like, I'm smart, I love science, and I want to help people. And those were great attributes, but none of that differentiated them. They would come in with incredible GPAs and wonderful undergraduate research experience or volunteer hours or patient care, but they couldn't describe in a sincere and compelling way what actually set them apart. What could they do and what were they put on this earth to accomplish and to show up as that no one else could replicate? And so when I ask my students this question, what I oftentimes do in a professional sense is ask it this way. I will ask myself or the people that I'm working with, what will the organization miss out on if you're not the one hired? What is it that I bring with my own unique skills and talents and relationships and experiences that impact the way I show up and the way I move through the world as an educator? And how can I describe that in ways that help people understand that I am a one of one? I am not a copy paste of somebody else. And I have the language to describe what sets me apart in a way that isn't tied to my GPA or my list of work accomplishments or my professional trajectory. So I think this is a great one we can start with ourselves, and whether that's through close family and safe friendships, whether that's through therapy, whether that's through a lot of self-reflection and journaling, how do you get really clear about what you bring to the table that can't be replicated by anybody else? Strategy number 2 is to ask great questions. One of my favorite books that I'll reference here at the end is a book by Celeste Headley. She's an NPR contributor, a radio host, a podcast creator, and she talks often in her book about this concept that no person ever listened their way out of a job. And she talks about how when we put ourselves in positions where we get to be the learner, we do a much better job of role modeling confidently humble behavior. So one of the ways I encourage my students to do that is through having an informational interview practice and always being in the habit of creating and building relationships with people who are in positions or with context that might be wider and broader than your own. So one example of this in my own life, when I was in my 20s, I was really struggling figuring out what I wanted to do. I had a graduate degree in student affairs, like many of you do, and I didn't know where my fit was. I didn't know what I wanted to do. I knew that I wasn't super happy in the first job I had right out of graduate school, but I knew I wanted to learn a lot more. And so what I did was I created this list of questions that I've used in my own life that I give to my students now and say, hey, think about who you can reach out to, either through your alumni network, through people on your university campus, through friends or community members. How can you get in the practice of asking people to share their expertise and their wisdom with you, rather when you have nothing that you need to gain from that experience? I find a lot of our students and a lot of the messaging that I've even perpetuated, unfortunately, has been to give them this kind of information when they're looking for jobs or when they need something in response. But if we can create the kind of environment where we're encouraging students to reach out to people in their networks with this list of questions, they get into the practice of practicing and trying on the perspective of being a proactive learner in a different way. These 5 questions are ones I encourage my students to go practice every month with someone new, whether that be through Zoom, online, or whether that be something that they do on campus here in Starbucks in my building. Get in the practice of asking really great questions and conducting regular informational interviews, even when you're not needing anything in return. Strategy number 3 is to seek out feedback proactively. So we know that confident humility involves having an accurate view of the way we're perceived by other people. We know humbly confident people and leadership educators allow others to speak into their lives and give them open, honest opinions. Most of us only receive this kind of feedback either during our formal review process at work or for our students at the end of the school year or the end of the semester. I'll never forget, actually, one of the things I often mention to my students. I had a candidate who was applying for a job I was hiring for about 5 years ago. And at the end of their interview, I said, do you have any questions for us as an interview team? And this candidate said to me, I'm curious, do you have any concerns about my candidacy that I can address for you while I'm here? And I thought, wow, talk about a powerful question to showcase confidence, that you're confident enough in yourself, you're willing to risk asking it, and the humility to know that we may have some reservations or concerns we want to ask you about. So that's a story I always share with my students as a way to be able to explain how can you seek feedback proactively in a situation like that. One way we can do that as leadership educators is to take a picture of the confident humility wheel and to ask our colleagues or our supervisor or even our students, where do you see me? How often am I camping out at the top of this? And how often am I falling to one extreme or the other to get feedback from other people? I also have my students in our senior capstone series do a 360 feedback evaluation. And instead of using any company or any particular external vendor that costs a lot of money, all I have my students do is create a Jot form or a Google form and send the following 3 questions out to 20 people in their lives. I have them ask these questions. Number 1, what's a skill or strength that you think I have or do exceptionally well? Number 2, what is one unconscious behavior, mannerism, or bias that I can address to be more effective? And number 3, what is one thing I could do differently to be better to work with or be around? I have my students create, again, just a 3-question survey with those 3 prompts. And I have them send it to 5 people that they've lived with on campus, 5 people they've worked with, 5 people they're related to, 5 people that they see as an acquaintance or somebody who's not in their inner circle, and 5 people who they think might be really direct at giving them honest, critical feedback. Not the parent or the best friend or the roommate who's going to sugarcoat things, but somebody who's going to say, yeah, I notice you interrupt a lot, or you like to tell us what you know, instead of spending your time seeking to understand the perspective of other people. So this is another great strategy we can even use ourselves as a way to role model this for our students. All right, moving right along. Strategy number 4 is to show and not tell. It's crucial that we are perceived as confidently humble in our own roles as leadership educators, but that's measured by other people's perception and not by our intention. That's particularly important for our students when a lot of our students are going to have decisions made about their hiring, their starting wage, their workload, their compensation. All of that's going to be determined by people who are typically 1 to 2 generational cohorts above them. And so we know that there's a lot of difference and diversity when it comes to value and the way that confident humility can be perceived through all sorts of social identities, through all sorts of ages, and through all sorts of workplace and community cultures. So one thing I encourage my students to do, particularly those who right now are in the Gen Z cohort, is to consider how might you get really curious about the way that confident humility is perceived by your direct supervisor or by your first employer when you graduate, particularly when those people are going to be at a different age and stage in their life than you will be. According to some of the data and the research, we know that there are actually a couple of behaviors that indicate strong, confident humility around supervisors of young professionals. And I'm going to share those with you now. Here are the few that came up the most often in the research. The first was keeping cell phones out of sight. The second was showing up a few minutes early to every meeting. Spelling first and last names accurately, particularly when those names are indicated in a person's email signature on campus or in the workplace. Using professional grammar and punctuation, showing gratitude with written thank you notes, and having a positive attitude upon correction or critique. Now, we all individually may agree or disagree with some of these. There's certainly a lot of nuance we don't have time to dive into today with these 6 things. But I'm reminded when I see this list, how many of these behaviors am I exhibiting myself in my own role, in my own work in the classroom, in my own advising and support of students and their organizations on campus? And for our students, I ask them, how many of these do you role model when you're the president of an organization or when you're trying to make some really powerful changes to the way that the students are experiencing this university? So this is another list that you can consider, is how do I show and not tell these behaviors as a way to be able to role model this effectively for my students? All right, finally, number 5 is to create a confident humility mission statement. One of the things I come back to time and time again is, with this particular skill set, how do I do a really good job of keeping it at the front of my mind all the time? It's so easy for me to do. If I were to show you the rest of my office, you can see the boxes in the background. I am notorious for taking notes during webinars like this. And then I fold them up and I stick them in a folder. And then 6 months from now, I find them and I think, oh yeah, that was an idea I had. I wanted to teach in class and I just totally forgot about it. So one of the ways I try to avoid that is through this confident humility mission statement. I'm going to share it with you on screen, but if you're somebody that prefers just listening as a way to be able to soak in this information, then I would encourage you to either cast a neutral gaze down to the floor or close your eyes. And I'm going to share with you this confident humility mission statement. This is just a template that I use for myself and my students. It's going to indicate 3 places where you will add in the actual behaviors or the kinds of skills you want to practice in creating your own confident humility. So here we go. As a leader, I seek to embody confidence and humility in my daily work. I will practice, insert behavior 1, to build genuine confidence, always remembering that my security, value, and worth are tied to who I am, not how I perform. As I collaborate with others, I will, insert behavior 2, to build sincere humility and approach each of my colleagues with the assumption that they have something to teach me. Ultimately, I will remember, insert your takeaway. Each day, may my words, actions, and behavior communicate open-mindedness and curiosity with the courage to share my true self and my ideas with others. As I do so, I'll model the kind of humbly confident behavior that builds integrity in me and respect with others. For those of you who closed your eyes, you're welcome to open them now. And if you want, if this is something that would be helpful for you, then you're welcome to take a screenshot of the slide and share it with your students. But what I encourage mine to do is to fill this in with a behavior they want to practice to build sincere confidence, a behavior they want to practice to remember to find sincere humility, and then their biggest takeaway from this series that we've been covering for the last 45 minutes. I tell students to do one of two things with this mission statement. Either take a screenshot of it and make it your lock screen on your cell phone, because that's something you see a lot. Otherwise, I have them post it on their bathroom mirror. And I say, ideally, if you're a college student, you're brushing your teeth twice a day. Read through this start to finish once in the morning and once at night, and see how it impacts the way you approach confident humility in your day-to-day world. See what you think. So as we come to a close, we have about 3 minutes remaining. I'm going to put the 5 strategies we've covered back up here on screen. Again, these are 5 strategies you can use among your students. They're also, I would argue, more importantly, 5 strategies that we need to do the work on ourselves as leadership educators to be sure that we are creating the kinds of skills that we need to affect positive social change. So take a look at that list. And if you would in the chat, I'd love you to just type the number of which of these strategies you want to focus on creating or implementing more of first. Okay, I'm seeing a lot of 1s and 5s. Awesome, some 3s too. Okay, we got a pretty good representation here. Wonderful. This is great. I tell my students often something that I'll share with all of you, and I mentioned at the very beginning, which is this idea that the best way to build this skill is to practice. We can't get better at something we don't try. And I think often we have a long history of seeing the power of college students affecting incredible change for our communities on college campuses over the last several decades. One of the benefits of confident humility is that it gives students a chance to learn a skill to work in the confines of the structure in which they currently operate. But that same skill set gives them the level of detail they need to move the needle and make change in those structures and the way they operate themselves. So I'll tell you just in closing, this was a skill set that really, really changed my own life personally without being too cheesy about it. This picture of me on the left, look at the fake, the absolute denial smile on my face. This was a picture that was taken after I had been rejected from 11 jobs in 3 weeks as a 24-year-old. And I remember very distinctly during that time feeling like I had no idea what I had to offer or what made me unique that other people couldn't replicate. But I also was really insecure with what I had to bring to the table. And it showed in my connections with students. It showed in my ability to interview and apply for new roles. And through implementing these 5 strategies myself, this is still something that I'm working on a daily basis. And it's given me the chance to be able to start a business, to be able to have the confidence to try out some of this curriculum with my students, knowing that I'm still working on it myself. And it gives me the reminder that as a leadership educator, if I'm not practicing what I preach and making sure that I am secure in who I am, I don't have any business trying to affect positive change in the lives of the people on this campus community. And so I got to start with me first before I'm working on assisting and supporting them in the incredible work that they're doing in theirs. So with that in mind, if you have any questions, we'll take those in just a second. But I do want to share with you, here's my email website if you have any interest in chatting more about this topic. If you have any groups of students or faculty or staff that you'd like to dive into this further, I offer that in a wide variety of different formats in person and online. But I want to share 2 other things briefly, just really quick with you before I turn it back over to Juan. The first are some additional resources. So some of the work that I referenced today was from these 3 books. If you're somebody who really likes to dive into some of the data or the research around this topic, Think Again is a great place to start. In the back index there, you can actually go right to the chapters that talk about confident humility and share the definition that I listed earlier. We Need to Talk is the book I referenced by Celeste Headley. Incredible, incredible book. I reread it every single January because it's so powerful in reminding me of the communication and conversational skills that I want to emulate for students. And then finally, Brene Brown's Dare to Lead is one of many really great resources for this kind of work, specifically around the concept of humility and the difference between humility and arrogance. So those are 3 books that you can take a look at. I also think when it comes to works cited, we're really quick to create a long list of APA citations that nobody looks at again. I think it's really important to display confident humility by showing the names and faces behind the people who are doing some incredible expert work and research around these topics. So these are 8 people whose work I have referenced today. If you're interested in diving more into the research and the work that they're doing, particularly around those confident humility myths, take a look here, and please feel free to reference Dr. Chaplin specifically for some of the myths that I mentioned earlier, and Farah Nasir for some of the work around humility with Dr. Brene Brown. With all of that in mind, we got 3 minutes left. One, I know you have some announcements. I'm happy to stay on for a couple minutes if people have follow-up questions, but I am going to turn it back over to you. Thanks for joining today.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Kristin. Is it all right if we do a screen share swap again? Perfect. There we go. So Kristin, thank you so much for that. One thing that, as I noticed myself just learning so much, like I appreciate when a presentation can be both theoretical and practical, because often I find experiences verge on one side or the other. So I appreciate all of the amazing food for thought and the fact that I have results of a little assessment that you gave us, and I'm going to be writing my mission statement right after this is done. So thank you for the practical takeaways in addition to the really amazing generative thoughts you shared. So this was a version of a LeaderShape program, and I think we as a LeaderShape staff always want to be sure that the folks who are interested in conversations like this know what else is possible in our community as well. So here is a QR code for our program guide that continue the same line of questions of what is possible and what might introspective leadership look like, and how do we use that in service of creating a just, caring, and thriving world. So this is a QR code that can lead you to that, including our new 1.5-day program that we're offering to the on-campus, which is Living in Possibility, a different version of the virtual program that existed starting during the pandemic. So we are excited to offer that, as well as the Institute and Catalyst as 3 of our main programs, in addition to Resilience and all the other fun things that you'll see in this QR code program guide. Another fun announcement is that we have merch. So shout out to Abby, my colleague, and Ben, our LeaderShape intern, for doing some amazing work getting our LeaderShape merch site up and ready to go. So that is on leadershape.org if you want to see some cool t-shirts modeled from the fine folks here and some other things to add to your LeaderShape swag collection. And then last, LeaderShape is co-sponsoring and on the committee for the LeaderShape Educators Symposium. So if folks are familiar with the Leadership Educators Institute that happens every other year, this is an awesome opportunity for the off year to still gather with leadership educators this year in Tampa, Florida. Who wouldn't want to be in Tampa, Florida in December, especially depending on where you are in the country? And so you can see the theme here for liberatory learning and leadership education. So an awesome opportunity to have a more intimate experience delving into that aspect of leadership education. And so you can see the details and registration info is on the National Clearinghouse for Leadership Programs website down there. So we hope to see folks there. All right, well, those are the only announcements we have. Thank you again, Kristin, and thank you everyone for making the choice to attend. And if Kristin, if you want to hang back for a minute in case folks want to chat, I will leave the room open and still be in here. But otherwise, thanks everyone for coming. We hope to see you for another conversation series session for the rest of the week. Thanks, y'all.